In the 19th century, the European powers carved up Africa as if it was as simple as drawing lines on a map. In a way, it actually was. Sub-Saharan Africa was backwards beyond belief. When the Europeans showed up, the wheel had not even been invented yet. The Europeans, in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, were up against societies that were primitive at best. There were a few hiccups, such as at Iceland Loana in the British case, or Adowa in the Italian, but other than that, it was a walk in the park. Few in Europe had any moral qualms about taking over this land that was rife with cannibalism and slavery. Missionaries began to flood into the newly conquered lands and spread the gospel to those who had lived in the dark for millennia. Big business set up booming industries with Africa's vast raw materials, and massive infrastructure projects were undertaken. Sub-Saharan Africa had gone from no wheel at all to trains in a matter of decades. Most important of all, the Europeans brought modern medicine, and indeed, civilization in general. Britain and France ended up becoming by far the largest powers in Africa, and their colonial wars were still taking place in the early 20th century. Even after the Great War, France was engaged in a bloody conflict in Morocco alongside the Spanish. No one batted an eye, and this was par for the course. When it came to Italy, however, suddenly attitudes changed. In 1911, liberal Italy pounced on the Ottomans whilst their attentions were focused elsewhere, and they seized what is today known as Libya. A few in the West kicked up a fuss about the matter, but Giolitti, the Prime Minister, ensured that it was a quick affair. The bandage was ripped off before any momentum could be built up against them abroad. From then onwards, the Libyans were in for a bumpy ride. The Italians were by far one of the most brutal colonial powers. Between 1930 and 1931 alone, 40,000 Libyan shepherds died on forced marches to internment camps. This is just one incident. General Graziani especially was ruthless when it came to pacifying Italy's most preeminent colonial holding. Even today, in the age of diversity and inclusion, no one cares or even knows about such matters. At the time, the world didn't bat an eye. Suddenly, as noted, something changed. The first 13 years of Benito Mussolini's reign were mostly peaceful, and he was the darling of the Western press. He had saved Italy from the very brink of left-wing anarchy and restored order. Italians had been increasingly unified under his rule, and there were influential foreigners rushing to Italy, begging for an interview or just an opportunity to meet the man. Winston Churchill's own wife was one of them, writing home to Winston of how masculine and powerful the Duce was. In Mussolini's mind, however, there was a desire to avenge the defeat of Adowa, and the Italian population at large felt much the same way. This was nothing new. Every government, ever since that fateful day in 1896, whether liberal or fascist, wanted some kind of settling of accounts with the Ethiopians. The goal was in no way set in stone. Mussolini was more than happy to come to a kind of arrangement, and the end result did not have to be total annexation. But regardless, something, in his mind, had to be done, and in late 1934, the Ethiopians, not the Italians, brought about the crisis that resulted in their annexation. This is the complete history of the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Two things before we begin. Firstly, the usual disclaimer. This video is in no way, shape, or form political. It is purely historical, so please don't overthink it, and take it any other way. Be normal, thank you. Secondly, a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members who make these videos possible. These videos take a rather long time to make, as I'm focusing on quality and sometimes rather niche content over quantity and clickbaity content. As a result, it is not ads that keep me afloat, but rather the kind subscriptions which so many of you have chosen to give, and it truly does mean the world. So if you do want to support the channel, join our Discord, or our weekly Paradox games, then please do click one of the links in the description. Thank you. Since coming to power, Mussolini had actually been far more moderate than the liberals who had come before him. In 1928, Mussolini signed a friendship pact with Ethiopia, with the intent of penetrating the country by economic means. Things seemed rosy, but 2 years later, Selassie began to behave more and more obstructively. Far greater aims began to enter Mussolini's head. Essentially, the reasons for conquering Ethiopia, or at least part of it, were twofold. Firstly, the prestige gained at home would be enormous. Secondly, and more importantly, Mussolini saw the opportunity to colonize the large fertile northern and central regions of the country with thousands of landless peasants. Italy's initial colonies in Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia lacked arable land, and any colonization efforts there had appeared wholly unappealing. They were essentially just desert. Parts of Ethiopia also had exploitable deposits of coal, copper, and gold too. The location, most of all, was perfect, as it would connect Italy's existing Eritrean and Somali colonies. In the early 1930s, Italian propaganda would paint Ethiopia as an unviable state that could not develop without the help of a European power. Italy, of course, was in Italian eyes the nation to fill that role. Many in the West agreed with the premise, given that the rest of Africa, who were at similar levels of civilization to the Ethiopians, were under the control of other European colonial powers. The French, especially, welcomed this obsession with Ethiopia, as it might take Italian eyes off of Tunisia, where the European population was half French and half Italian. The best card the Italians had in terms of propaganda was slavery. Ethiopia had an estimated 2 million slaves, and despite Selassie's public claims that, quote, Ethiopia will be without a slave in 15 years, end quote, he was not doing much about it, and he himself owned tons of slaves. By 1934, Benito Mussolini considered it the right time to do something about Ethiopia and made diplomatic approaches to Britain and France along these lines. Ethiopia in 1934 had only recently been unified, if you could call it that, under the leadership of Rastafari, better known as Haile Selassie, who held the title of Negus. His Amhara tribe, whom were, at least on paper, Oriental Orthodox Christians, had subdued the other, mostly pagan or Islamic tribes. The nation was well known for being a brutal slave state, if you could call it a state. Nicholas Farrell writes in his biography of Benito Mussolini, quote, the Negus called it an empire, for that is what it was, and he termed himself emperor. Ethiopia was not a nation, and yet it was a member of the League of Nations. In the Evening Standard on the 13th of February 1935, the pro-Mussolini Evil in War attacked the sentimentalists, liberal humanists, and do-gooders who insisted that Ethiopian independence be defended against Italian aggression. He wrote, Abyssinia is still a barbarous country. It was taken bloodily and is held, so far as it is held at all, by force of arms. The Negus had no more right to rule it, he said, than did Italy, end quote. In 1906, the British, French, and Italians had signed a secret treaty which carved up Ethiopia between the three of them in case the state collapsed. It did not. In 1923, Ethiopia, as noted, a nation where slavery and parading around heads on spears was normal, joined the League of Nations. Britain, of all people, offered stiff opposition. Some even called for a crusade against Ethiopia to abolish slavery. Even the foreign minister's wife said exactly this. On the flip side, it was Mussolini himself who encouraged Ethiopian entry into the League. The conquest, clearly, was no long-term plan, and Mussolini, quite rightly, felt that the British and the French wouldn't care if he wanted to do what he wished with Ethiopia. They did, after all, own most of the rest of Africa between the two of them. Mussolini was busy in Ethiopia itself too. A political office was established to liaise with the Italian legation in Addis Ababa. Here, a policy of divide and conquer was prepared. Ethiopia was extremely decentralized, and provisional governors, the Rases, were sounded out to see who was disloyal and would accept money to buy their loyalty against Selassie. Whilst Mussolini attempted to win over the British, the French, and the Rases, the Ethiopians imprudently attacked first. The border between Italian Somalia and Ethiopia was far from clear like European borders were. In the southern Ogaden Desert, the villages of Geragube, Warda, Galadi, and Walwal were near a line of strategic wells. The Italians had a garrison there, much of it made up of local Somali troops. The Ethiopians had sent the occasional expedition north into these regions, but crisis had always been averted. In 1934, however, Selassie grew bolder and began sending forces north and even began building roads into evident Italian territory, north of the disputed area. On the 22nd of November, a joint British-Ethiopian demarcation team suddenly arrived at Walwal, and the Italian commander said he had no prior knowledge of the team's arrival and he refused to meet them. One Ethiopian officer attempted to start a fight and was taken prisoner before he could hurt anyone. Tension continued to build between the two sides, and the British just left as there was nothing they could do. The Ethiopians, however, began to build up troops, and so the Italians did likewise, and for a few days a sort of cold war ensued as the two sides exchanged insults. By the eve of the fighting, the Ethiopians had amassed 1,500 well-armed men, whilst the Italians had a mere 500. On the morning of the 5th of December, the frustrated Ethiopians' impulse control failed them, and they began to rain down bullets upon the Italians. This, however, was a grave mistake. The far better trained and equipped Italians proceeded to send a number of light tanks and armoured cars into the fray, and the Air Force made an appearance too. The Ethiopians bravely held their ground, much to the Italians' surprise, and they even outright charged at some of the light tanks and managed to disable a few. No matter how brave the Ethiopians were, however, there was only ever going to be one winner. And after 2 days of intense fighting, there was 100 dead Ethiopians and 30 dead Italians, with many more wounded on both sides. Once word got back to Mussolini, he seized this opportunity and laid out his demands. Quote, the governor of Harar to proceed in person to Walwal to offer ceremonial apology. Then, payment of $200,000 indemnity, arrest, dismissal, and punishment of those guilty after they shall have honoured the remains of their victims in accordance with Somali custom. End quote. The demands were light if it meant averting war, but Seleucus' pride got the better of him, and he refused to accept the humiliation. Instead, Ali Nur, the commander responsible for the attack, was promoted. Meanwhile, the Italian commander, Captain Simorati, was promoted to major, and the press called him the hero of Walwal. War, it seemed, was now inevitable. Any war against Ethiopia was going to require a Herculean effort in the infrastructure department. This was one of the most godforsaken lands on earth, if you were an invading army. The scorching hot climate and the mountainous terrain together made for quite an obstacle. On top of this, in the north, in Eritrea, the Italian port of Massawa could only handle 2,000 tons of goods per month. In the south, in Italian Somaliland, Mogadishu could only handle 200 tons per month. If any war was to even be fought, never mind won, these facilities had to be upgraded immediately, and the Italians did just that. One of the main sources of labour was from nearby Yemen, where the workers were used to these conditions. Despite this, 500 people died in the early stages of building alone. These foreign workers were seen as expendable if it meant the ports would soon be able to supply hundreds of thousands of Italian troops. The roads, too, were essentially non-existent. These were quickly whipped into shape, and slowly but surely, the infrastructure of Italy's holdings in the Horn of Africa were built up. The population of Asmara in Eritrea alone went up by a factor of 10 in a single year due to all the construction going on. There would now be roads, but there had to be trucks and animals to use on them. A mad rush for whatever trucks could be purchased abroad ensued, whilst Italy's manufacturers struggled to keep up with demand. As for animals, 600,000 mules and camels were going to be needed to supply 200,000 troops. There was a lot to organise just to invade one primitive African nation, and the preparation alone was stretching Italy well beyond its limit. Diplomatically too, Mussolini continued his mission to make the British and the French reach an understanding. On the 4th of January 1935, a friendship pact was signed with France along these lines. Pierre Laval, the French foreign minister, agreed to give Italy 114,000 square miles of insignificant desert in southern Libya, as well as 21,000 square miles of coast in French Somalia. In return, Italy gave up their claim to Tunisia. More importantly, however, Farrell writes, quote, "On the surface, it looked as if Mussolini had given something for nothing, but Laval also told Mussolini that as far as France was concerned, Italy could have a free hand in Ethiopia, though Laval would later deny it. Even in the text of the Accords themselves, however, it is clear that Laval had given his tacit approval." End quote. In Britain, matters were a little harder, as the Conservative government were bending to leftist pressure from the Labour opposition, despite the absolutely gigantic Tory majority. In February, Mussolini sent his troops down the Suez to Eritrea and Somalia, and the British and French did nothing. The next month, the British government sent the permanent undersecretary at the Colonial Office to report on if British interests were at stake in Ethiopia. He reported in June, quote, "No vital British interest is concerned in Ethiopia, except the headwaters in Lake Tassana and the Nile Basin." End quote. In the British embassy in Rome, there was an extremely reliable Italian spy who copied documents for the Duce. These, including the report, all reveal that the British would seemingly not interfere at all. In April, Britain and France met with the Italians at Stresa in northern Italy, at Mussolini's behest. The topic of discussion was Germany, not Ethiopia. The Duce wanted a firm commitment on Austria, whose independence he wanted guaranteed by the Western powers. Austria was a matter of grave concern to the Duce, and it was a friendly buffer state which was vital to Italian foreign policy. A border with Germany, in his eyes, could be catastrophic. The French were keen to make a commitment on Austrian independence, yet the British were not, and they remained intent on appeasement, and only offered moral support. In the end, however, the Stresa Front was established. Quote, "The free powers, whose political objective is the collective maintenance of peace within the context of the League of Nations, are in complete agreement to oppose, by all means, any unilateral repudiation of any treaty which might endanger peace in Europe, and will act in close and cordial collaboration to this end." End quote. The wording of the document, however, was very deliberate. When it read, "which might endanger peace in Europe," this was done at the behest of Mussolini, who suggested that, in Europe, be added. "Let's not take on commitments which are too big," he joked. Everyone in the room very clearly knew what he meant, and they all agreed to it anyway. Mussolini clearly took this as a green light, as he said to Grandi, who was present, quote, "You told me that the English would reply yes to the Austrian question, and no to the African one. Instead, they replied no to Austria and yes to Africa." End quote. In June, the British continued on the path of appeasement with Germany and signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in violation of Versailles. The only logical conclusion was that the British would not care about Ethiopia if they seemed to care so little about Germany. Germany too was now involved with Ethiopia, and Hitler was sending guns to Selassie. The plan was to bog Italy down and shift the focus of the great powers to Mussolini's empire building, not his own deconstruction of Versailles. A longer war meant a bigger international incident. Selassie said that Hitler was Ethiopia's only sincere friend in Europe. On the 8th of June, a message from Sir Robert Vansittart of the Foreign Office read, quote, "Italy will have to be brought off, or Abyssinia will eventually perish. That might in itself matter less if it did not mean that the League would also perish, and that Italy would simultaneously perform another volte-face into the arms of Germany." End quote. This laid out the British position clearly. They wanted to appease Italy so that Mussolini did not invade Ethiopia, as otherwise they would be forced, against their wishes, to oppose him in the name of the League of Nations. It was nothing personal, but they felt they had no choice. It was a bizarre hill to die on, and one they knew would have sincere implications when it came to moderating Hitler in Europe. Vansittart proposed giving Mussolini all of British Somaliland in order to appease him. On the 23rd of June, Anthony Eden came to Italy to meet Mussolini, but the two ended up detesting each other. Eden was miles out of his depth, and he could only offer Mussolini meaningless concessions that both parties knew the Ethiopians would never accept. That evening, Mussolini refused to go near Eden, and said to an aide, quote, "The distance between us is exactly equal. If he wants to speak to me, he can come over here." End quote. The next day they met again, and Mussolini laid out plainly what he wanted. This was a mandate over Ethiopia, much like the British had in Egypt. Eden rejected it out of hand, and from then on there was no more negotiation. The summer passed by, and all attempts to defuse the crisis came to nothing. Vansittart, permanent Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, said that to alienate Italy over, quote, "so relatively petty a matter would be lunacy." End quote. The British public did not help their government either. There was a League of Nations ballot organised to gauge public opinion, and of the 11.5 million Brits who voted, 10 million said that if a member state were attacked, the other states should be compelled to stop the aggressor. 87% said this should be done by economic sanctions. 59% said that military force should be used. With the general election coming up in November, it was impossible for the British government to take a pro-Italy stance. They were now handcuffed to a country where, quote, "barbarity, slavery, and the parading of decapitated heads on spears were the way of life." End quote. The Echo de Paris commented, quote, "What are 100,000 Italians threatening Ethiopia next to 10 million soldiers who are being drilled between the Rhine and the Niemen, and to what end? To defend themselves?" End quote. The British Empire, the biggest colonial power in world history, was stamping on the spirit of Stressor, the last chance to stop Hitler, over a colonial war against a barbaric, tribal state that could barely be called a state. Madness had prevailed. Things got worse. On the 11th of September, Sir Samuel Hoare, the British Foreign Secretary, gave the unintended impression at a League of Nations assembly in Geneva that his nation would stop Mussolini by force if necessary. The delegates in attendance roared in approval. Part of the Home Fleet was then sent to reinforce the Mediterranean Fleet. Mussolini, in response, moved 2 divisions to the Libyan border with Egypt. On the 28th, Selassie presided over the Maskal, aka End of the Rains Feast, in Addis Ababa. Evelyn Waugh was present for the Daily Mail. Quote, "At 1:30 p.m, the Emperor in military uniform drove to the spot, escorted by soaking lancers. He took his place on the throne and sat waiting alone and immobile while the rain turned to hail. It swept over the grandstand, burst through holes in the roof, and torrents of water ran down the streets. Priests, arrayed in ceremonial vestments, huddled together under cover while they waited for the Archbishop to begin the celebration at a kind of maypole which had been erected. The old man ventured out, walked 3 times around the maypole, threw a wand, bearing a bunch of yellow daisies to the foot of the pole, and hurried back to the shelter." End quote. As it turned out, the rain did not stop that year. Instead, war was soon to begin. On the 1st of October, Selassie refused an offer by Mussolini to avert war, in which he would give Mussolini, quote, "the large vassal regions of Abyssinia." End quote. Essentially, this was all the tribes Selassie had just conquered, and so he of course turned this down. The next morning, Mussolini went to see the king, who told him, quote, "Duce, go ahead, I'm right behind you. Forward, I say to you." End quote. On the 2nd of October 1935, Benito Mussolini declared his crusade against Ethiopia from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia. Quote, "Listen, a solemn hour in the history of La Patria is about to strike. 20 million people are reunited in this moment in the piazzas of Italy. Never in the history of the human race has there been such a gigantic spectacle. For some months, the wheel of destiny, under the impulsion of our serene determination, has been moving towards this destination. We've been patient with Ethiopia for 40 years. Now, enough." End quote. In his speech, he accused the League of Nations of trying to deny Italy her place in the sun with sanctions, the very peak of hypocrisy. Fascist discipline, sobriety, and sacrifice would overcome this interference, the Duce said. Italy had never, in all of its history, been more unified than it was on that fateful day. In the Great War, you had interventionists and isolationists. Here, the nation was behind their Duce, 100%. Amongst their number was essentially the entire Italian clergy. Abroad, the Catholic Church found itself rather opposed to the war, yet in the Vatican State itself, and Italy, this was completely inverted. The Pope had a few misgivings about the planned war, but by July 1935, it was reported, quote, "The Pope is pleased with the Italian action in Africa, for the success of the Italian army would assure to the Catholic missions in Ethiopia supremacy over the Coptic clergy," end quote. Pius XI kept a stoic silence on events in Ethiopia throughout the war publicly, and as the supreme pontiff, this was really all he could do. The rest of the clergy, however, viewed it as a missionary crusade against pagan barbarity. On paper, Ethiopia may have been an Oriental Orthodox nation, but this church had long since fallen away from the mother church in Rome, and Ethiopia was Christian in name only. As mentioned, pagan barbarity was the law of the land, not the laws of Jesus Christ and his church. Shortly after the war had begun, Cardinal Schuster, the Archbishop of Milan, held a mass in the Duomo, in which he asked God to protect the troops, as, quote, "At the cost of their blood, they opened the door of Ethiopia to the Catholic faith and Roman civilization," end quote. Late on the evening of the 2nd, leaflets were dropped on all the towns and villages on the Ethiopian border, warning the civil population of their impending liberation so they could make arrangements. And then, at dawn on the 3rd of October, Benito Mussolini's crusaders crossed into Ethiopian territory. The Negus of Ethiopia proclaimed, quote, "Arise, each of you, take up arms and rush to the defense of your country. Rally to your chiefs, obey them with a single purpose, and repel the invader," end quote. The invader was by this point 200,000 strong. The Italians also had 100,000 workers and thousands more handling the infrastructure side of the invasion, which even the biggest critic of the war found impressive. In the north, there were 3 roughly equal columns, which together totaled 100,000 men, led by General de Bono. The terrain was extremely challenging, with few roads, and so the 3 columns had no real means of staying in touch with each other. The Ethiopians had been told by Selassie not to resist far in the north, but with his forces being led by highly autonomous local chiefs, or rases, this did not go as planned, and there were tiny skirmishes all along the front, which were quickly swept away by the far better organised Italians. Meanwhile, the Italian Air Force began to bomb Adowa, the scene of their nation's greatest defeat, and the Italians' main early objective. En route to that fateful town, the Italians took village after village and proclaimed the abolition of slavery. Most slaves, however, perhaps rightly, asked how they were now going to be fed. To Ethiopians, slavery was completely normal and a fact of life, and had been their way of life for their entire history. The Italians weren't much bothered with the details, however, and freed the slaves and carried on with their offensive. Most slaves just found employment with their former masters. On the 6th of October, Adowa fell, and the Italian flag was raised over its ruins. The 6,000 killed in 1896, often in a bestial fashion, had finally, after 39 years, been avenged, not to mention the thousands of others carted off into the Ethiopian abyss to be used as slaves. Italy's greatest defeat loomed large over the nation, no more. The town of Axum fell shortly afterwards, but then on the 10th the advance came to a halt, with de Bono citing logistics problems to Mussolini. His trucks simply were not getting enough fuel. There was a few minuscule gains made until early November, but then that was it, and all that followed was a simple consolidation of the very small positions already taken. Mussolini was far from impressed. One of the forces facing the Italians was the 10,000 strong Ethiopian army led by Ras Gugsa, the former son-in-law of Haile Selassie. For months now, Gugsa had been taking payments from the Italians, but Selassie, who knew about this, chose to believe that Gugsa was just taking advantage of the Italians' gullibility and would fight by his side when the time came. On the 8th of October, however, Gugsa arrived at General de Bono's headquarters with 1,200 of his men, having failed to persuade the other nearly 9,000. De Bono was disappointed with how few troops had crossed over, and he looked Gugsa in the eye and asked him how many of the men he had just brought over could be counted on. Gugsa could not hide that his men were extremely unreliable. Regardless, the betrayal was done. There were further betrayals, as the Mariotti column, made up of mostly Eritrean colonial troops and Danakil tribal troops, set off into the desert with 10,000 Fela coins to recruit more locals at Elefan. When they arrived expecting thousands of volunteers, however, only 200 turned up. At this stage, the Italians began to plan their next offensive towards Addis Ababa. De Bono and Mussolini agreed completely when it came to the plan, but they disagreed heavily over the speed at which it was to take place. Mussolini wanted it all over and done with quickly due to the League of Nations sanctions, and more importantly, the draining economic costs on Italy, but de Bono urged caution. The Ethiopians had not committed themselves to a serious battle in the north yet, and so their forces were almost completely intact. The last thing Debono wanted was another Adowa. The Duce soon had enough, and in early November, General Badoglio, the Secretary of State for Colonies and Chief of Staff, arrived in Eritrea. During his 10-day visit, he discussed the possible use of poison gas to General Debono, but Debono made it clear that he was seriously against using such weapons. Badoglio, however, saw it as fair game, as the Ethiopians were using blatantly illegal dum-dum bullets, aka expanding bullets, and regularly mutilating almost all of their prisoners. As for issues of supply, Debono was absolutely obsessed with improving his supply lines from Eritrea before he advanced any further. Many Italian commanders had estimated that it would take several years to conquer Ethiopia, and Debono was clearly one of them and was not in a hurry. On the 11th of November, Mussolini sent a clear order telling Debono to resume the advance southwards. Instead, he got a long-winded reply explaining why he could not, and why a delay was necessary. The main point of the message was that 300 miles of his supply line was a single track, and would need to be drastically upgraded before any offensive could be launched. On the 16th, Mussolini replied and accepted the delay, but the next day a follow-up message dismissed Debono from his post. Marshal Badoglio, as expected, took his place. There seemed to be no love lost, as Debono, one of the 4 leaders of the March on Rome, was promoted to Marshal upon being dismissed, told that he had completed his mission, and apparently he was relieved to be rid of the task. Meanwhile, Solace had his own plans. He ordered his troops to withdraw from any Italian offensive, drawing the invaders deeper and deeper into the rugged terrain and extending their supply lines. Then, and only then, he ordered, should the Ethiopians begin a brutal guerrilla war that would send the Italians running home. This tactic also had the benefit of making Italy seem like a crazed aggressor in the international media. The problem was, however, that the Rases were old and stuck in their ways, naive to the modern world that Solace understood so well. The Rases wanted to fight one grand battle in which they would defeat the Italians like at Adowa. But this wasn't the 19th century anymore, it was the 20th. And the Italians were ready and even inviting the Ethiopians to dare fight them man-to-man in pitched battles. The outcome was obvious to both the Italians and Solace, but not the Rases. When Badoglio arrived, he was disgusted by the condition Debono had left his troops in. They were strung out with poor communication, and he also disagreed with arming Gugs's turncoat Ethiopians, who he quickly disarmed. He said of the Rases, quote, "The Rases, with no qualities at all as commanders, looking askance at each other, interested above all things in keeping and strengthening their own positions, absolutely incapable of appreciating a situation or thinking out a maneuver, and above all of translating them into action." End quote. The front may have been static as winter came around, but in Europe diplomacy was at its peak during the war. As soon as the British elections were wrapped up in November, the British stance changed. The Conservatives maintained their huge majority, and as the British ambassador to Germany put it, quote, "Ethiopia was merely child's play compared with the German problem." End quote. The British and the French came together to create the Hall-Laval Pact, named after the two countries' foreign ministers. The plan would have given sovereignty over much more of Ethiopia than had previously been offered, especially a large area in the south, which was to be for, quote, "economic expansion and colonization," end quote. The British, in return, would cede Ethiopia a seaport in the north. Laval had been in contact with Mussolini, and the plan had been created based on these discussions. On the 9th of December, the pact was agreed on in the British cabinet, and in Italy, the Grand Council was called to discuss the matter. One of the Italian divisions on the Egyptian border was removed, and everything seemed to be falling into place. Suddenly, however, the plan was leaked to the French press on the 13th, and a public outcry ensued, especially in Britain. The British public was not a fan of handing over a large chunk of Ethiopia to a fascist nation. Pro-Ethiopian propaganda had been pumped out en masse around the world, and this pact was totally antithetical to the media narrative. On the 18th, Solace, disgusted, turned down the plan outright once word got to him, and the British government sacrificed Sir Samuel Hoare, the foreign minister, and he promised to keep his mouth shut about the rest of the cabinet's involvement. The French government survived the crisis, but in January 1936, it fell anyway over the economy. Solace realised that the current diplomatic situation was evidently not in his favour. He would have to expel the Italians himself, somehow. With this thinking in mind, the Ethiopian Christmas offensive was launched. He began to pressure his Rases to go onto the offensive, with the 190,000 men at their disposal. The plan was overambitious, to put it lightly. The goal was to split the Italian forces in two, and then go on to conquer Eritrea and push them into the sea. A laughable prospect. Even getting his Rases to act in unison was an impossible task, and so the attack was an extremely confused and disjointed one. In early December, the Ethiopians marched on Abiy Abiy, which was fortified by Eritrean troops. It took 3 entire days to reach the first Italian defences, and the Ethiopians were bombed to pieces the entire way. By the morning of the 18th of December, however, they finally reached the town, and hand-to-hand combat ensued with the Eritreans. The Italian pilots had a nightmare supporting their ground forces, as the Africans were so close together and all looked the same. The clouds of dust, kicked up by thousands of bootless African warriors, didn't help either. The close combat went on for 10 entire hours, and both sides were now losing hundreds of men each. At dusk, however, the ever-loyal Eritreans won the day, and the Ethiopians were repelled, although they had fought bravely. Ras Seyum, the Ethiopian commander, set up camp a few miles south of the battlefield and was far from disheartened. A few more men, he believed, could have brought him victory. Both sides buried their dead and licked their wounds, and then on the 22nd the fighting continued. Italian reinforcements, however, had arrived on the 19th and were ready to join in the counter-attack. Ras Seyum was also reinforced, and he sent all the men he had into an all-out offensive on Abiy Abiy. The Italians' 6 Eritrean battalions marched out into the desert to confront the approaching Ethiopian columns, supported every step of the way by Italian artillery. The fight began at dawn, but once again a confused mess ensued as a series of battles took place amongst almost isolated units. The Ethiopians this time took the upper hand over their Eritrean opponents, and even overran some of the Italian gun crews. By the afternoon, they were at the edge of Abiy Abiy, where they faced 2 battalions of entrenched Eritreans. After a few hours, the Ethiopians broke through. The civilian population sided with their fellow countrymen and helped the cause. 300 Eritreans became casualties before they were able to withdraw. The Italian forces fled northwards and regrouped 15 miles away. It was a bitter defeat. Marshal Badoglio was absolutely seething with rage. Elsewhere, the forces under Ras Imru were in disarray. His men viewed him as an impostor who had been imposed on them, and chaos ensued. As his army marched towards the Italians, a series of rebellions broke out, and thousands of his men deserted and went home. His forces were already in disarray when the Regia Aeronautica arrived and bombed them to pieces, shattering their morale. An even larger number of his troops now deserted, but despite losing half of his men, Imru set off with the rest of his army and launched an offensive towards the Italian-held western Tigray province. On the 15th, the 2,000-strong vanguard crossed the Takazi River, where they came across Eritrean irregulars. The irregulars called for support, and some tanks arrived along with some cavalry. The battle at Dembaguina Pass ensued. One tank advanced, and many Ethiopians fled in the face of this strange contraption, but some brave warriors did not, rushing the tank and banging on its hatches demanding the surrender of the men inside. The 2 terrified crewmen complied. No sooner as they climbed up the tank, however, the savage Ethiopians decapitated both of them with a saber. The watching Italians and Eritreans alike were horrified by this sight and chose to break out of the trap. With the 9 remaining tanks, the Italians advanced, and 2,000 of the Ethiopian soldiers broke and ran. The Ethiopian commander accused his men of being women and shamed them into staying and fighting. Hand-to-hand fighting then ensued, and the Italians became surrounded. Major Kraniti was wounded, and 2 of his officers were killed. The Ethiopians launched a full assault on the encircled Italians, and with most of their officers dead, the majority of the Italians surrendered and begged for mercy. The tank crewmen refused to surrender, however, and tried to drive out of the pass. The Eritreans followed the vehicles in their trucks. Those Italians who could not reach the tanks and trucks were slaughtered in barbaric fashion by the Ethiopian horde. Most of the fleeing trucks were caught and again butchered in bestial fashion. Only 3 of the 9 tanks managed to escape. Only 2 of the tank crewmen who had been caught survived because they shouted out "Christos," and some of the Christians among the Ethiopians took pity on them. But as noted, the rest of the crews were not so lucky. The few men who escaped were chased down along the road to Aksum, which was only 30 miles away. The pursuing Ethiopians ran into a relief column of black shirts, but these too were ambushed, and again, a number of Italians were killed and more tanks were destroyed. By the 16th of December, the Ethiopians were a mere 12 miles from Aksum. Hundreds of Italians and Ethiopians alike had perished. It was a pitiful performance. The Ethiopian casualties, however, were utterly disproportionate. Losses from desertion and casualties suffered in the battles, and from air attacks, resulted in there not being much of a force left of note, 12,000 at the maximum. In Aksum, 30,000 Italians were waiting for them. On the 23rd, the Italians came in their planes and bombed Imru's forces to pieces, and the first use of mustard gas took place. With morale already low, chaos ensued, and Imru, the Ethiopians' most capable commander, was left to pick up the pieces. It was only he who stood between the Italians and Addis Ababa. Whilst the north of Ethiopia was mountainous, the south was a desert, which posed a totally different set of problems for Graziani's crusaders. Philip Jowett writes, quote, "Logistically, operations in the south were largely limited by the constant problem of supplying thousands of troops with water in the desert conditions." End quote. The Ethiopians, of course, had the same problems, and by December time, many of them were living on roots and berries. The south was always going to be a sideshow compared to the north, and so the early war consisted of what were essentially limited raids across the Ethiopian-Somali border. The town of Dolo near the border with British Kenya was swiftly captured, and a bombing raid was dispatched towards Gorohe, the biggest town on the border, in which the arms stores located there were almost all destroyed. Defending Gorohe was left in the hands of Grasmach Afewerk, an elderly but highly capable commander who came from a tribe who were traditionally raised as slaves. The garrison was 3,000 strong and relatively well armed for Ethiopian standards. As the bombs came raining down on the town, Afewerk personally manned an anti-aircraft gun to prove to his terrified men that the bombers could indeed be countered, and he stayed at his post no matter what. This strategy soon backfired and he was wounded by shrapnel. A few days later, the wound turned gangrenous, and he had to be physically dragged away from his anti-aircraft gun. He died on the way to hospital. Selassie ordered that the men who left their posts to help him should be punished. The younger of the two was given 30 lashes, and the senior officer was given 32, as well as being ceremonially stabbed in his back with a bayonet. Both men had all their property confiscated. All this for trying to help their brave commander. Ethiopia remained as barbarous and backwards as ever. The death of Afewerk utterly demoralised the garrison, and by the time the Italians arrived, most of the garrison had simply fled. For the invaders, it was just a matter of walking in and taking it. The next stop was Negali, and here too the Italian Air Force reigned supreme, and the rear of the Ethiopian army was utterly disrupted. Ras Desta, the local commander, ordered a full-scale head-on attack, but it seems that many of his men just refused. This gave Graziani time to organise his armoured vehicles into position to attack, and the Ethiopians were cut down in droves. They attempted to flee, but the fast-moving motorised Italian units outflanked them and killed them in large numbers. After this initial success, Graziani halted and sent telegrams to Mussolini pleading for more troops. His efforts were also helped by the Sultan of Sheveli, the Somali ruler of a fiefdom in southern Ethiopia. As soon as the war began, the Sultan, whose people were often enslaved by the Ethiopians, swapped sides, and his private army of 2,000 men was greatly appreciated. Back home, Graziani's calls for more troops were being answered by none other than the Italian clergy. Giovanni Casani, the Bishop of Cremona, proclaimed, quote, "The blessing of God be upon these soldiers, who, on African soil, will conquer new and fertile lands for the Italian genius, thereby bringing to them Roman and Christian culture," end quote. Each and every soldier en route to Ethiopia was provided with a prayer book, produced especially for the occasion, with an introduction written by Monsignor Gemelli, a strongly pro-fascist prelate with extremely close ties to the Pope. Gemelli's text reassured the Italian crusaders, quote, "Soldier of Italy, your sacrifice, united with the sacrifice of our Lord Jesus Christ, God among men, will achieve the salvation and greatness of the fatherland," end quote. Often, weapons were blessed too. One cameraman captured a priest intoning "Holy, Holy, Holy" as he blessed the bombs being loaded onto a Caproni bomber. Criticism of the war was brushed aside. Superior General of the Jesuits, Ledachowski, said that criticism was, quote, "a pretext from which international Judaism is profiting in order to advance its attack on Western civilization," end quote. The Bishop of Nocera, Umbragaldo, Tadino, Nicola Cola, hit back at the critics, quote, "The Ethiopian war is just and holy, and it is necessary for the defence of, as vital a part of our fatherland as the colonies, for the pressing expansion of our enemies, and for the assertion of our right as a civilizing nation. Ethiopia is but a mixture of uncivilized tribes. Its people have no true notion of the duties of man, of his rights, of its freedom. It is a people which, having become detached from Rome, cannot get the full benefit of the Christian ideas, which has not been able, therefore, to produce those beneficial conditions to which the west of Europe owes its greatness. Roman Catholic Italy has the duty of bringing to populations deprived of them its principles of equity, charity, and fraternity," end quote. In November, a mass campaign took place in which women from all over the nation donated their wedding rings for the good of the nation. The us versus them mentality that had sprung up after the sanctions had been imposed had worked wonders for Italian unity. In Rome alone, 250,000 women heeded the call. The Queen herself was among their number, and Mussolini donated 2,262 kilos of precious metal from his vast collection of presents collected over the years. In return for the rings, the women of Italy were presented with a steel ring instead, which were all personally blessed by Italy's bishops to thank them for their contribution to the fascist and Catholic cause. Priests from all across the nation, too, donated their pectoral crosses. The Bishop of Civita Castellana personally walked up to the Duce, took off his golden pastoral chain, and gave it to him, followed by a fascist salute. The Bishop of San Miniato in Pisa then stepped forward and told Mussolini, quote, "For the victory of Italy, the Italian clergy are ready to melt down the gold of the churches and the bronze of the bells," end quote. From now on, troops would be shipped out carrying various Madonnas or consecrated copies from across Italy. The troops themselves, too, would be blessed. Church and state had never seen such unity for centuries. In early January 1936, Ras Desta, the foremost Ethiopian leader in the south, chose to attack the Italian army led by General Graziani. Imprudently, he then set off into the desert with his 24,000-strong force without sufficient ammunition, never mind food and water. The offensive was no surprise too, as Desta had openly boasted about his plans. Desertions immediately ensued during the desert march, and by the 6th, Desta was reporting to the emperor that his soldiers were starving and some were dying from dehydration. Others were dropping dead from various diseases that were spreading through the ranks of his malnourished army. The march took them from well to well, harried the entire way by the Regia Aeronautica, who dropped both gas and explosives on them. By the time the first Italian outposts were reached, the Ethiopian force was down to 15,000 men, most of whom were not fit for battle. Desta's Western advisors begged him to cancel his plans for a full frontal attack and suggested guerrilla warfare instead. Desta, however, refused all advice. General Graziani's forces had barely moved since October, and the general had extremely reluctantly accepted Badoglio's instructions to keep his forces on a defensive footing. Finally, after months of waiting, Graziani received a reply from his appeals to Mussolini, in which he was given permission to partake in, quote, limited action, end quote. On the 12th of October, his 14,000-strong force began their march deeper into the Ethiopian interior. In Graziani's eyes, his forces were still insufficient, and he was cautious as they advanced, not taking any chances. For good measure, any Ethiopian fixed positions were drowned in mustard gas. The Battle of Canale Doria, as the upcoming battle is known, was more massacre than battle. If there was any competent general in the Italian army, it was Graziani. From the get-go, the Ethiopians were torn to shreds, and the superior Italian forces picked up victory after victory as they attempted to push the Ethiopians back from any water sources. Soon enough, all the usable wells were in Italian hands, and the Ethiopian columns, stranded in the desert, began to go literally insane from first, never mind from the ceaseless bombing raids. In a final gamble, Desta bizarrely sent his cavalry up against the Italians. The result was the utter destruction of his best troops, and the destruction of his army as a fighting force. The Ethiopians broke ranks and fled for their lives, chased every step of the way by the far more mobilized Italians. Most ended up perishing from first, and the battle was no longer a battle, not even a massacre, but a hunt. Italian machine gunners were camped out at all the nearby wells, and whenever any groups of Ethiopians went to break for it to quench their thirst, they were cut down in droves. Desta, for his part, fled north with his Belgian military advisor and his bodyguards in 2 trucks. His men were left to die. On the 20th of January, the Italians marched into the town of Negeli, where the offensive wound down. Graziani had achieved a resounding success, the biggest of the war so far. The Ethiopians had been annihilated in the south in early 1936, yet the south was a mere sideshow compared to the north, which is where the real war was being fought, and where the majority of the resources had been dedicated. Over 200,000 Ethiopian troops were up there, and were itching for a major victory. Their issue was, however, that they were spread out across a 200-kilometre front with very little communication. The Regia Aeronautica also, as always, made life difficult for the Ethiopians too. The skies were purely Italian territory, with no competition. Marshal Badoglio chose to go on the offensive to disrupt the Ethiopian preparations for their own offensive. Command was given to a General Baroli for the offensive. Baroli's Eritreans quickly made good progress and captured the towns of Nebri and Nagada on the 20th of January, seriously interfering with the separate Ethiopian army's ability to communicate with each other. The next day they attacked the town of Melfa, which by the end of the day effectively resulted in a draw with some fierce resistance from the Ethiopians. Ras Kassa rushed in thousands more men, but they were quickly encircled. Kassa radioed his emperor for help, yet none came. On the right of the main advance, the 28th of October Blackshirt Division was advancing westwards towards the Ethiopian strongholds of Zaban Kakata before moving on to the Waru Pass, northwest of the main fighting. When the Blackshirts arrived, they found 3 large formations of Ethiopians dug in on the heights. What followed was described by eyewitnesses as 19th century tactics as the Blackshirts attacked. The results were predictable, and 2 battalions lost 50% of their officers as they bravely led their men from the front. A chaotic withdrawal followed. The Ethiopians held their hilltop positions despite suffering brutal losses. The Ethiopians saw victory in their grasp, and Dejazmach Biru, their leader, commanded them to push onwards. 100,000 Ethiopians could now potentially charge through the Waru Pass into the Italian rear, and Badoglio fell into a state of panic, ordering all stores north of Mekelle and Adowa to be prepared for destruction. If Adowa did indeed end up falling, then the propaganda victory for the Ethiopians would have been incomprehensible. The Blackshirts, however, despite being so heavily depleted, held out against the Ethiopian counter-offensive and held the pass. An Eritrean division came to their aid, and on the 24th of January, the battle came to a conclusion, with both sides utterly exhausted. The battle was viewed as an Ethiopian victory, but it was Pyrrhic at best, and they had lost a whopping 8,000 dead. The Battle of Tembian was officially the high watermark of the Ethiopian war effort. Elsewhere, Ras Mulugeta had been ordered by his Negus to occupy a strongpoint on the road between the Italian base at Mekele and Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital. The strongpoint was a mountain range 12 miles south of the Italian base called Amba Aradam, and that's where the following battle, the Battle of Amda Aradam, gets its name. Ras Mulugeta's forces quickly found overwhelming Italian forces gathering around their stronghold before the battle had even begun. Haile Selassie ordered Ras Kasa and Ras Sayum to come to his aid, but this wasn't how the tribal Ethiopians did business. The idea of a commander leaving their defensive positions to rush to the aid of another commander simply was not a thing in the mind of the Ethiopians, and thus the far more modern-minded Selassie was ignored. The Italians quickly learned that they could isolate and destroy each Ethiopian army piecemeal, and the backwards Ethiopians would never adapt. Just in case, Badoglio sent a single Blackshirt division towards the other two armies, who could have come to Mulugeta's aid. Both of them spotted the Italians and immediately withdrew without a fight. Mulugeta was on his own. In early February, the great assault on Amda Aradam was almost ready, and intermittent skirmishes were taking place around the base of the mountain. On the 15th, it was finally time to go, and the gigantic bombardment took place. The inexperienced and frankly stupid Ethiopian artillerymen simply did not understand their weapons despite lessons from Western advisors. The artillery battle was as one-sided as the air war, and the 23,000 Italian shells that were dropped on the mountain caused absolute havoc, alongside the bombs dropped by the 170-strong bomber contribution from the Regia Aeronautica. The Italians made rapid progress up the mountain, and Mulugeta placed his defences in the wrong place. He also didn't move against the Italians whenever they managed to take a few footholds, a huge mistake. Soon enough, the entire mountainside was covered with mostly Ethiopian bodies, and Italians were swarming towards his position. He withdrew with his men towards another mountain, fighting and dying every step of the way. By the 16th of February, so after a single day, the battle was basically over. All the Ethiopian strongpoints had been captured, and Ras Mulugeta was fleeing with his men across the dangerous mountain passes. Badoglio proudly proclaimed to watching journalists, quote, "Gentlemen, you have brought us luck. The mountain that has been weighing on our stomachs for so long now is now ours," end quote. The figures are astounding. Out of a force of 20,000, 6,000 Ethiopians lost their lives, and twice that number were wounded. According to Jowett, the losses are probably underestimated too, as the Ethiopians had no time to keep count. The Italians took 621 white casualties and 145 Eritrean. Of these, only 188 were dead and 599 were wounded. Almost all of the Ethiopians captured on the mountain were simply shot out of hand. Ras Mulugeta had fled towards the expected sanctuary of the Amba Alagi mountain with his small remaining group of fighters. Desertion began to plague his forces, and things went from bad to worse. The Italians pursued at full speed, and the Ethiopians began to panic. Mulugeta begged and pleaded to his other Rases to come to his aid, yet they did not. On the 19th, he simply retreated with his entourage, leaving his men to their fate, when he could quite easily have arranged a more organised retreat and saved many of them. The territory he and his small force were fleeing through was dominated by the Raya Gala people, who absolutely detested him. On Mulugeta's advance, he had abused the Galas. Now, as Mulugeta retreated with his men, bogged down by their many wounded, they were harried by sniper fire from the rival tribe. The Regia Aeronautica, too, hammered them with bombs. One bomber raid killed Mulugeta's son, but the Ras heard that he was only injured, and so he rushed to his aid. The Raya Gala marksmen spotted him, surrounded him, and then, as he leaned over his son's body, grieving, they shot him to pieces. The Italians, meanwhile, captured the mountain with almost no resistance. In a cavern on top of the mountain, the Italian Alpini forces found an old Maxim gun that had been hidden by Major Toselli on December 7th, 1896, during the Italian last stand against the Ethiopian assault on that very same peak. It was a joyous moment with gigantic propaganda implications that meant the world to every Italian. Toselli and his brave defenders had been avenged after 40 long years. Meanwhile, the Mihail Safari, aka the Army of the Centre, had been torn to shreds. Badoglio now took the opportunity to bring overwhelming forces to bear on the joint armies of Ras Sayum and Ras Kasa. The Ethiopians were 40,000 strong, but immediately these forces began to dwindle as desertion spread through the camp like a plague. By the time the fighting started, there was only 30,000 of them. The Italians, meanwhile, had 120,000 men with 50,000 in reserve. It was complete overkill. The first task was to take the peak of Work Amber. The small Alpini force with some Eritrean Askaris and black shirts, 150 strong, simply climbed the mountain and found the Ethiopian defenders asleep. They were all dead within 5 minutes. Ethiopians never fought by night, and the idea that they could be snuck up on in the dead of night did not occur to them. The peak was quickly fortified, and any Ethiopian attempts to retake it were repelled with extreme losses. On the 27th of February at Abiy Abiy, the Ethiopians were drawn up, ready to face the Italian attackers. As they approached, the Ethiopians charged at them with a carefree attack, quickly ran out of ammo, and resorted to attacking with swords and spears. The result was a slaughter, and Ras Sayyum had to recall his men. A general retreat now began, and thousands of Ethiopians began to die as they were pursued relentlessly. Desertion was the rule rather than the exception, and the Regia Aeronautica, as usual, reigned supreme. The emperor ordered a general retreat, and 2 weeks later Ras Kassa and Ras Sayyum walked into the emperor's camp with just a handful of followers. Their initial force, as noted, was 30,000 strong. The Second Battle of Tembien had been a total Italian victory. 2 of the 3 prominent Rases in northern Ethiopia had now been not only defeated, but obliterated. The last of the 3, with significant forces left, was Ras Imru, who was seen as the most forward-thinking commander Ethiopia had. Imru's men had been sending raids deep into Eritrean territory, and had massacred a number of road-building workers, and Imru had quickly gained a reputation for terror. Prisoners were almost always killed, and almost all of the dead that were found were horribly mutilated. Defeating Imru's men was a task that would be an honour for any Catholic Italian. This was the very barbarism that the clergy of Italy had united behind. Defeating Imru was indeed a crusade against backwardness, paganism, and barbarism. Jawad writes, quote, "Some reports said his men caused more problems for the Italians than all the other Ethiopian armies put together," end quote. On the 26th of February, Imru received the news that Ras Kassa's army had been defeated, and the emperor told him to withdraw from the Shire mountain range before he was encircled. Reluctantly, he agreed to do so, and he prepared to move out with his 20,000 strong main army. Facing him was Badoglio's 47,000 troops, thirsting for revenge. On the 29th, the Italian offensive began with the goal of enveloping Imru's men. The withdrawal continued, but an 8,000 strong force had taken up defences on the rocky terrain, which formed the Shire Ridge. The Italians, ridiculously, did not send out recon patrols, and so they walked right into an ambush. The initial casualties were terrible. The advance, however, continued despite this, and they pushed ever forward, thinking of all the innocents whom Imru's forces had mutilated. It was a hard battle with the Italian morale often sagging, but it was often raised again by officers reminding the men of their heroic task. The Duke of Bergamo himself, commander of the Gran Sasso division, found himself lost in the moment, rushing to the front and shouting "Savoia" as he charged the savage Ethiopians with a grenade in his hand. His men had to physically stop him from charging and risking his life in this way. When Mussolini heard of this incident, he telegraphed the Duke and personally thanked him for his bravery. The Ethiopian attacks were powerful, often damaging, but ultimately suicidal. Imru felt himself to be on the edge of a heroic victory, but as the hours ticked by, the Italian superiority in weapons began to tell, and the savage Imru was shocked and demoralised by the sheer volume of Italian artillery fire. Worst of all, Imru's men were now running short of ammunition. The Ethiopian army was prone to just randomly firing in the air and screaming whenever they were overcome with emotion, and essentially had no impulse control. The wastage was ridiculous, and it soon began to tell. By the 3rd of March, his men had essentially run out completely. A retreat ensued, and the familiar story once again took place. The artillery and Regia Aeronautica smashed Imru's forces to pieces as they fled. The hunters had now become the hunted. Half of the Italian force alone, the Second Corps, had inflicted a ridiculous 15,000 casualties on Imru's forces already. By the time the Fourth Corps arrived, there wasn't even many Ethiopians left to deal with. By the 4th of March, it was clear, the Battle of Shire had been a resounding victory, a true crusade. Imru and his 5,000 remaining troops scattered around like rats, trying to hide. The remnants were saturated with bombs and poison gas by the ever-reliable Regia Aeronautica, and morale fell to pieces. Imru had planned to start a brutal terror guerrilla campaign in the face of defeat, yet this quickly became impossible as his men simply deserted him. Soon enough, all that remained was him and his 300-strong personal bodyguard. A month later, Imru rocked up in Addis Ababa, completely alone. By now, Selassie felt that the final defeat was inevitable. His Rases in the north had been obliterated one by one, and now the road to the capital seemed wide open. Despite the odds, however, Selassie chose to gamble on one last final showdown to defeat the Italians, even if it would require a miracle to pull off. 30,000 troops, cobbled together from the other armies which had been annihilated, had banded together under the personal command of the emperor. Selassie personally led his men to Maiche on the 20th of March, which was where the Italian army was encamped. Here, they were joined by the demoralised remnants from the north. Badoglio felt himself ready at any time to deal with Solesi's new army. The only problem would be if they retreated south, extending the Italian supply line. Originally, at the start of the war, this had been Solesi's whole plan. Now, however, Solesi was ignoring his own advice and fighting a pitched battle against a far superior European army with his completely backwards army full of unreliable elements. Solesi also utilised no OPSEC, and the Italians simply intercepted his radio messages. One on the 21st of March to his wife stated that he was planning to do battle in the last days of March. The Italians were extremely well entrenched, and had coated the floor outside their fortifications with broken glass. Amazingly, the Ethiopians simply did not use boots. The emperor just didn't issue them, as he felt it would make his men weaker. Jowett writes, quote, "Although the emperor listened respectfully to his advisors, he had already decided on an all-out attack, regardless of its chances of success. Haile Selassie was about to commit the same fatal error that he had been lecturing his Rasas about for months. He was about to make a full frontal attack against a well-dug-in enemy who had an overwhelming superiority in firepower." End quote. The emperor, unable to control his impulses due to his rage from defeat after defeat, had chosen to charge like a raging bull, facing a matador into his own defeat. The Ethiopians openly set themselves up as if about to attack, and so the Regia Aeronautica simply dumped gas and bombs all over them. Most of the day was spent taking cover. The Ethiopians, again lacking any impulse control, began firing wildly into the air like crazed lunatics at the planes, blowing through their extremely limited ammunition supply. By the time the battle actually came around, the Ethiopian army not only had very limited ammunition, but they were also totally demoralised. On the eve of battle, each of the 3 Ethiopian columns were commanded by one of the previous defeated Rases. It was to be a repeat of the previous 3 battles, all rolled into one with the same characters this time around. Early in the morning of the 31st of March, the Ethiopians loudly moved to their starting positions. The Italian sentries spotted this a mile away and let their men know what was coming. At 5:45 am, the first Ethiopian attack began. In some places against the weaker Eritrean lines, the Ethiopians broke through and penetrated the trenches, but this was only ever due to sheer weight of numbers. The main result can be imagined. It was the same as always. Italian counterattacks slaughtered any Ethiopians who did get through, and the attackers were pushed back into the killing zone outside the fortifications, where they were shot down in droves. Point-blank artillery fire sent crowds of Ethiopians sky high, and many of the attackers now just cowered behind cover. It was a massacre. Most were soon out of ammunition, having shot most of it into the sky at the bombers in the previous days. Soon, desertion set in, especially among the less loyal tribes making up this cobbled-together force. Like Napoleon at Waterloo, the Negus decided to send in his Imperial Guard, the best forces by far that Ethiopia had to offer. At 6 am, they attacked, and indeed made some progress, but ultimately this was futile. Hundreds were killed charging over the last 100 yards towards the Italian lines. The guardsmen, like the rest of the Ethiopians, charged in barefooted, cutting their feet to shreds on the broken glass covering the floor. The entire area had been cleared beforehand, and laid out especially to slow down and then slaughter anyone who entered with machine gun fire. It was essentially impossible to penetrate such a position. To make matters worse for the Ethiopians, the skies suddenly cleared, and the Regia Aeronautica was let loose and began to strafe the last Ethiopian reserves waiting to go forwards again and again and again for 2 entire hours. Any remaining will to fight that the Ethiopians had was absolutely gone. Only mostly isolated pockets of Imperial Guards continued to fight on. The battle had ended in 14 hours, and the Emperor left the battlefield with his entourage. Behind him, he left 8,000 of his men dead on the ground, not even counting the wounded who were also left to die. The Italians, for their part, lost 332 Italians, 68 officers, and 837 Eritreans. The retreat was a disaster for the Ethiopians. Once again, the Gala tribe began to attack random columns of troops, killing any isolated units they could find. Most troops hadn't eaten for 36 hours before the fighting had begun, and now here they were, retreating in the harsh terrain. The Italian Air Force once again were allowed free rein, and untold numbers of Ethiopians were killed as they fled for their lives. For 2 days this continued as bomb after bomb, including gas, were rained down upon the unfortunates below. Only 1 bomber was shot down, in return for thousands of dead and thousands of wounded. It was estimated that more men died during the retreat than died during the battle. Almost incomprehensible numbers. The road to Addis Ababa now laid wide open. The armies in the south of Ethiopia were now led by Ras Nasibu. He was widely seen as one of the most forward-looking commanders, and skillful, and the Italians acknowledged that he and his 80,000 men had to be dealt with. On the 1st of April, Mussolini messaged Graziani, quote, "Instinct tells me that now is the time to give Nasibu the flogging he so richly deserves," end quote. For the previous few months, the southern armies had simply consolidated. only launching minor raids occasionally into the Ethiopian interior. The action had all been in the north, as the Ethiopians suffered defeat after defeat. On the 8th of April, however, a contingent of 10,000 Ethiopians advanced and dug in 18 miles from the Italian forward lines in the Ogaden Desert along the banks of the Garawadi River. The Ethiopians stationed themselves on the so-called Hindenburg Wall, which was the only man-made fortifications used by the Ethiopians during the entire war. It was essentially an unimaginative and unimpressive 15-mile-long trench system. The Italians had seen a lot of their Eritreans desert over the past few months, as their loyalty had been taken for granted, and they were badly treated. Graziani, however, did not much care. He wanted his Libyan division, which he so deeply adored from his time-fighting guerrillas in Libya over the years. Soon enough, he got his wish, and he could truly rely on the troops at his disposal now. On the 14th of April, Graziani's offensive began. Mussolini cabled in, quote, "Today, April the 14th, our advance guards will reach Dessie. Even on the international scene, the rhythm of events is accelerating. There is not a moment to lose, my dear Graziani. I await the news that you have begun your offensive on Harar," end quote. Graziani was less than impressed. Mussolini was displaying a serious lack of understanding of conditions on the ground, given that Graziani's men were in the middle of a desert. Only 15,600 of these 38,000 men were Italian. Regardless, they set off in 3 columns. The left column set off with minimal resistance. Berkut fell to them on the 18th, Dagamedo on the 24th, and then Hamanley on the 25th, followed by Dagobur on the 30th. The centre and right columns of the Ogaden offensive, however, had to deal with the Hindenburg Wall, and they reached these trenches on the 16th without encountering any major resistance. When the attack on the wall began, it was manned by just 1,800 defenders, even though an estimated 30,000 were needed. The defenders had a mere 60 bullets each, and these ran out almost immediately, as the Ethiopians, again, had no impulse control when it came to firing. They fired wildly, quickly, and thus ran out of bullets. Ras Nasabu rushed up reinforcements to the line, as he knew that once it fell, his army would disintegrate, and fierce hand-to-hand fighting ensued. On the 17th, however, the Ethiopians withdrew. The Italians made no immediate attempt to pursue. After the fall of the wall, all that was left were the fortified towns of Sasabene, Harar, and Jijiga. All 3 fell by the 8th of May, as the Italians advanced across a broad front. The Ethiopians, meanwhile, fled for their lives into the ever-shrinking interior. All that remained of the Ethiopian army in the south was now a leaderless mob. They now began to loot their own cities like bandits. Ras Nasabu managed to reach Addis Ababa and agreed to go into exile with Selassie. When Selassie was defeated in the north, he fled towards the town of Dessie. The Italians sent their Eritreans in pursuit, paradropping them supplies as they went. It was a race to Dessie. Selassie got to within 25 miles of the town, only to be informed that it had just fallen to the enemy. The race now had a new destination, Addis Ababa itself. Badoglio decided not to leave the future up to chance. The Ethiopians were currently defeated, down and out, broken, demoralised. If he could rush for the capital now, he could end everything right away. If he waited, there was a chance the Ethiopians could undergo a revival. There was never any doubt about what option to pick, and the so-called March of the Iron Will ensued. The biggest problem facing the columns heading for the Ethiopian capital was not the Ethiopians themselves, but rather the terrain and the sheer number of vehicles. Constant backups and congestion was a nightmare. Bridges had to be built over rivers and gullies, and engineers were frequently called upon to produce miracles. More infrastructure was being built in Ethiopia in a month than had been built in thousands of years. 400 miles ended up taking the main column 15 days. The far less over-encumbered Eritreans had actually already nearly reached the capital, but they were ordered to set up camp and wait for the mechanized column. On the 30th of April, meanwhile, Selassie got back to Addis Ababa, which was by now in chaos. The city was being inundated with leaflets, which warned the Ethiopians not to resist what was coming. Here, the Negus desperately tried to piece together a force from whatever manpower could be summoned from the provinces remaining in Ethiopian hands. Not surprisingly, most refused to answer the call, refusing to fight for a lost cause. The Emperor, however, was playing a double game and was no different. He wanted to escape as well and had approached the British for asylum, which they accepted. On the 2nd of May, Haile Selassie fled the capital by train along with his entourage of dignitaries and slaves towards French Djibouti. Mussolini could easily have destroyed the slow-moving train, and Graziani requested permission to do so, which would have sealed Selassie's fate. Mussolini, however, was feeling magnanimous and let Selassie flee into exile. He would now live in Bath, England, for the next few years, where he was largely forgotten about. As soon as the Negus had left, the capital fell into utter chaos, as the Ethiopian troops began to rape and pillage their own capital city, as well as initiating a mass arson campaign for some reason. By the time the Italians arrived, the entire city was in ruins, as most of the main buildings had been burned down and anything of value had been stripped and taken away by the violent looters. On the 5th of May, Marshal Badoglio trotted into Addis Ababa on a white horse, where he was quite rightly greeted as a liberator, given what the city had been through in the past few days. Figures for losses overall in the war vary massively. Nicholas Farrell puts the figures at 2,500 dead ethnic Italians, along with 1,600 dead mostly Eritrean, Somali and Libyan troops, although this is probably extremely low. On the other side of the scale, the losses are almost incalculable. Given that Ethiopia was a highly decentralized society, living in conditions that were barely even medieval, it's not surprising that records weren't great. It's safe to say, however, that the Ethiopian dead were probably not far off of 100,000. The biggest loss for Italy was not in terms of soldiers, but in terms of the economy. The deficit rose from 2.5 billion lira to 16 billion, and in October 1936, the lira was devalued by 40%. Mussolini's Italy, financially, was never the same again. As Richard Washburn Child, US ambassador to Italy, said in 1923 though, quote, "Not long ago, I heard a speech made by a foreigner in Italy who was used to dealing with economic statistics. He was trying to account for the new life in Italy on the basis of comparative statistics. I told him he could not do it until he could produce statistics of the human spirit. I told him he could not account for everything in Italy until he could reduce to statistics that wonderful record of the human spirit, which in scarcely more than half a century has created a new Italy. I told him he would have to account for the number of Italians who in 1848 and 1859, in the Great War and in 1923, had a cause for which they were willing to die." End quote. Fascism was never about money, it was about something else entirely. The people were willing and able to pay the price economically, and they did so. On the evening of the 5th of May, Mussolini spoke to a crowd of 200,000 from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia. Once he was finished, he was brought back out for a total of 10 encores. On the 9th, during another speech, Mussolini named the king Emperor of Ethiopia and proclaimed the resurrection of the Roman Empire. Quote, "Raise on high your emblems, your arms and your hearts, to salute after 15 centuries the reappearance of the empire on the fateful hills of Rome." End quote. He shouted to the crowd, quote, "Will you be worthy of it?" End quote, to which they screamed back, "Yes, yes, yes." He was called back to the balcony not 10 times, but 42 times this time around. The people of Italy celebrated the 9th of May late into the night. The next day in cathedrals and churches all across the nation, millions of Italians celebrated special masses of thanksgiving. Ethiopia, however, was not destined to remain in Italian hands for long, but that is another story entirely for another video in the not so distant future.